So welcome everyone to what I hope will be the first of many winemaking sessions hosted by the American Wine Society. You know, winemakers have been an important part of the American Wine Society from the beginning. You know, in addition to wine consumers, you know, there were many members of the American Wine Society who were grape growers or winemakers in the 70s and the 80s. And they were interested in these hybrid grapes that came to the US from France in the 1960s. And they wanted to do things like plant vinifera in places like Ontario and New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And at the time, these were marginal, very, very strange ideas at the time. And, you know, none of the land-grant universities were paying much attention to these options. And the American Wine Society back then, they published their own technical papers, and they acted like a crowdsourced experiment station in many ways. In fact, one of my first experiences in the AWS when I joined in the mid-1990s at the age of 10 was with the Rochester AWS chapter. And you know, the Rochester AWS chapter, mostly winemakers. They used to have a winemaking seminar. It was in a hotel. It was very legitimate, very above board for an afternoon. And they had both professionals like Chris Stamp and Derek Wilbur and Carl Shively and those guys present sessions alongside some of their own members who were also accomplished, wonderful winemakers. In fact, if you look throughout the AWS's half-century history, you will find that there were more than 100 amateur winemakers who turned commercial, most of whom ended up starting their own wineries, generally on this side of the Rockies. And in fact, our speaker today is one of those people, Daniel Pambianchi, who has been a longtime AWS member and former owner of a commercial winery in Canada. But before I introduce Daniel, I have a trivia question. And this question is going to be, deal with the topic that we have before us today. So in the 90s, when I was learning how to make wine and we didn't have the benefit of the internets, you know, you had to rely on advice from others. So there was a bit of advice about when you would do your final racking, when you would have had tartrate stability in your wine, when you would do your final racking off of whatever sediment was left. But it wasn't a time in the sense of a date or a time on the clock. It was a time when something happened.
Full moon.
Can somebody, no, Daniel, you can't win. It's a time when something happens and when something is happening in nature. So, what is that time when we are supposed to do our final racking, when our wines would have reached tartrate stability? The wines that we bottled in Michigan, or not Michigan, I'm sorry, in the fall. The wines from the prior vintage. No, not a full moon, malolactic, lunar schedule. No, keep guessing. What is typically happening? What's typically happening outside when your wine goes through the final, no, not cold, not beginning of, wait, I almost thought somebody, somebody said winter. Blooming.
Frost.
Somebody said blooming. I think we have a winner. Yes, it's blossom time. It was that once you see flowers, that's what, and I don't know if this is accurate or not. Daniel, is this a time when you would have reached tartrate stability? But that's usually when I brought my wine in off the porch and I did the final racking. And that's when I did it. So I did see someone post bloom there. Hopefully you're an AWS member and we're going to make sure we get you the book. So Daniel has written a number of books. But I don't think he's written one quite like this. This really seems like the compilation of a lifetime of work in this business and a lifetime of knowledge. You know, one of the things I like about this book is it tells you not only how to do something, but it tells you why to do something. And it's actually a great reference book that you will use for a long, long time. One of the things that really stood out to me was a summary of all of the grape varieties and, you know, what you can expect from color, mouthfeel, acidity, and also recommendations of what yeast would go with a particular variety, which I think would be a great help when you have access to a broad range of different types of grapes or juices and you're not too sure what to expect. You know, I think this would be a great help. Just this part, and that's a small part of a 600-page book. We're going to have a Q&A after this, and feel free to drop some questions or comments into the chat, and stay tuned for some very special announcements before we wrap up. I might step away from my Hollywood Square here, but it's just because I'm enjoying Daniel on the big screen in my parlor with my friends. And I'm going to be drinking a homemade wine made by my friend Leon, and it's a sparkling Riesling. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Pambianchi.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Let me get this going. Here we go. Okay, can you all see the screen? I assume you do. David, if there's a problem, let me know.
Yes, looks good.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you and welcome everyone. We've got such an amazing response for this webinar, so thank you all for taking the time to attend. Today's topic is fining and bottling. Why fining and bottling? I remember as a young winemaker, one of my biggest frustrations was the inconsistency in bottled wine, not with quality, but rather with stability issues, such as renewed fermentation or tartrate crystals that David was just talking about, forming in bottles. And so there was a lot of anxiety planning and executing the bottling process. And these are all too common occurrences with both novice and experienced winemakers too, often because of wanting to rush through the process and bottle as soon as possible. Since a lot of you are experienced winemakers, I won't go into the actual processes for fining and bottling. I'm sure you're all familiar with those, but rather I'll focus on process improvements you can make and also talk about some gotchas that you need to be careful of. All this towards making great wines more consistently. Okay, here we go. Okay, slides weren't advancing, sorry about that. So yes, you can find more details on the information that I'm presenting here today in my new book that David presented, which was published just last fall. You'll also find on my website many useful downloadable tools, such as running acidification bench trials, my SO2 calculator, a yeast planner, and many more tools. In this webinar, we'll look at specific steps from fining to bottling wine, including filtering, as well as pre-bottling checks and how to make adjustments when needed to help you be more consistent and minimize, if not eliminate, post-bottling instability risks. Let's look at fining. Fining is more than just about achieving clarity. It's also about stabilizing wine against colloidal instabilities using flocculating or fining agents. Examples of colloidal instabilities include proteins, which can cause perfectly crystal clear wine to suddenly turn cloudy, or tartrate crystals to form in bottles forgotten at the back of the fridge. Fining also includes removing unwanted substances such as methoxypyrazines, those compounds that give wine vegetal green bell pepper aromas in, for example, underripe Cabernet fruit or Carmenere, especially Chilean Carmenere, which is always a challenge, it seems. And one of the most important aspects of fining is modifying or correcting mouthfeel. For example, overly bitter or astringent tannins, flavors and aromas, as well as color. This is really your last chance to make corrections before you bottle. A significant process improvement, and certainly one of my best improvements that you can make in your pursuit of making crystal clear, brilliant wines is to measure something called limpidity. This is done using what is called a nephelometer or turbidimeter. It's a bit of an investment, but well worth every dollar. You'll also be able to use the nephelometer for conducting bench trials, bentonite bench trials specifically, for checking protein stability. So the nephelometer measures clarity in NTUs, or nephelometric turbidity units, and increasing NTU values indicate decreasing limpidity. Now, coming back to protein stability, if this is something you want to explore as a possible enhancement in your winemaking, it involves subjecting wine samples treated at different bentonite rates to heat and then measuring NTU and choosing the bentonite rate that gives the lowest NTU. The point is, you don't necessarily want to go to full 1 gram per liter of bentonite if you can achieve the same NTU or limpidity with, let's say, half that rate. Beyond 1 gram per liter, bentonite can in fact start stripping flavors and aromas. So, how do you apply this knowledge in your winemaking? With NTU measurements, you can assess a wine's visual aspect and determine if it needs further treatment, either fining or filtering, or if you can go ahead and bottle. I don't bottle whites unless the wine measures under 1.1 NTU, and similarly for rosé wines, which I shoot for under 1.4 NTU and reds under 2.0. Sure, you might get away with NTU readings above these thresholds, although a trained eye might detect the slight imperfections. However, wines with NTU readings above these haziness thresholds that I have in that chart will definitely look hazy to any wine drinker. I use NTU data to choose a filter grade also. For example, if I'm ready to bottle a red wine and I measure around 5 NTU, somewhere around here, and I want to get it to a brilliant finish, and that the wine is stable, and so filtration down to 0.45 micron is not necessary, then I may decide to do a pre-bottling fine filtration at 1 or 2 microns. But if the wine is at, let's say, 15 NTUs, so it's sort of in this range, then I know that I can skip coarse filtration, but that I'll first need to do a medium or bright polish filtration in the 2 to 4 microns range before my final fine filtration. The problem I see all too often, especially with novices, is folks wanting to skip, for example, a coarse filtration of a very cloudy wine. If I was to measure the NTU on some of those wines, they would be in the 100 plus microns range, which would require a 10 micron filtration first. But they will go right to a 5 micron filtration and have pads clog up very, very quickly. So we'll come back to these last few entries here regarding microorganism reducing filtration in just a moment, because this is very important. So let's answer the question, why filter? It's primarily to avoid sedimentation in bottles or staining glass. And staining glass is acceptable in aged reds, but it should not happen in a young wine. And it's particularly a pain because whereas a hot water rinse works well with bottles of aged wine, you will need to use an appropriate cleaner such as percarbonate to wash bottles. So it becomes quite a chore. Filtering is also used to give wine that extra shiny, brilliant appearance. Filtering may also be necessary to protect against microbial instabilities, what we refer to as sterile filtration. So anytime you have more than 2 grams per liter or 0.2% of residual sugars, or more than 100 milligrams per liter or parts per million of residual malic acid in a wine that has undergone malolactic fermentation, then you need to sterile filter down to 0.45 micron. And we'll come back to these in a few minutes and look at these in more details. But first, the choice of a filter medium, that is pads versus cartridges and disposable versus reusable, is entirely up to you. What you have to make sure is you understand filter media rating, that is nominal versus absolute, and there's a big difference. Nominal means that the filter medium will filter more or less at the specified micron rating, but that larger particles may be allowed through, or smaller particles may be blocked. There can be a fairly large variance between the rating and the actual retention. For example, if a filter cartridge is rated for 2 microns nominal, it might let through somewhat larger particles than 2 microns, and likewise block smaller particles. Absolute rating is much more precise and with much smaller variance. It means that more than 99%, often more than 99.99% of particles greater in size than the stated micron rating will be filtered out. These differences are due to manufacturing processes and materials, as well as physical-chemical properties of the filter medium, filtering pressure, and wine chemistry. What about aroma, flavor, and color stripping, though? Well, aroma and flavor molecules are much too small to be filtered by the type of filter medium used in winemaking. Differences in pre- and post-bottling taste are usually due to improperly prepared filter medium, and most commonly what is called bottle sickness, which is caused by rapid oxygen pickup during filtration, and which causes some acetaldehyde to form. It's the same thing that happens at bottling, no different. As for color, you're really filtering what will eventually sediment or stick to glass. Sure, if you intend to drink your wine within a few months of bottling, you can forego filtration if you're happy with its clarity. Sterile filtration. I referred to it a couple of times. What does it mean? What is required to achieve a sterile wine? Sterile is a bit of a misnomer because it means removing greater than 99.9999% of microorganisms. And this is only possible with fancy, advanced, very expensive equipment used in medical labs, for example. But we don't need wines to be sterile anyways. We just need to reduce the microorganism population, that is yeast and bacteria, by 90%, or ideally closer to 99.99%, so that we effectively remove any real risks of yeast or bacterial re-fermentation or spoilage. And you can only achieve this with filtration at 0.45 micron, and that's 0.45 micron absolute rated. Some wineries will go as low as 0.2 micron for greater protection and less risk. Okay, great. So it's possible as home winemakers to filter down to 0.45 micron absolute. The problem now is bottling the wine under sterile conditions, which is practically impossible in a home winemaking setup, as microorganisms are always present in the air and all surfaces. And so the risk is that you sterile filter. Yes, David?
Oh, Daniel, I have the poll. Do you remember the poll we were going to run? Would you like me to run that now, or do you want to?
Sure, I'll take a sip of water in the meantime.
All right, I'm going to launch this poll. If everybody will take a look at it. It's about whether or not you sterile filter. Daniel, while you take a sip of water, I will tell you, we had a question from Mr. Fritzy. He wants to know if it's okay to sterile filter high pH reds.
It should be, well, at higher pH, you've got a higher risk of microbial spoilage because microbes thrive at higher pH. So yeah, I would recommend sterile filtration of higher pH wines, although that is not necessary if the wine is completely dry and has completed malolactic fermentation.
Terrific. Oh, and one other question we had earlier, Daniel. Somebody asks if there's any truth to the use of bananas as a fining agent. I mean, I know bananas were used for other things in the 1970s. I'm not too sure about a fining agent. What do you think?
I don't see what's in bananas that would fine. There's also a lot of potassium in bananas, so that would add some tartrate instability and I imagine banana flavor to your wine.
Oh, okay. Well, that might be nice. There's a lot of popular commercial wines out there that certainly come off as very banana. So there, I think we see the results there, the filtering question. We have 48% who say they swear by filtering. We have 15% who say no, they don't, but they heard it's bad for wine. They heard that it's bad for wine and my wine is fine usually. And we had 38% who said they might try filtering, but they would need to know about the cost and what all is involved.
Of course, your survey is skewed because you assumed that somebody didn't want to filter. They assumed it was bad for wine, and that's not a necessarily acceptable conclusion. I don't find a filter for different reasons. So there.
Thank you, Paul. That's true. I was trying to make the questions a little bit more exciting than yes, no, maybe.
Well, excitement is not necessarily good.
All right. Thank you. Okay, Daniel, back to you.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes. So the risk is that you sterile filter a semi-sweet wine at 0.5 micron and bottle immediately. So there is a risk. It's a small risk, but however, it's still a risk that the wine may re-ferment. So as an amateur, you may decide to take the risk, but if you're running a commercial operation without access to sterile filtration and sterile bottling, you'll definitely want to add sorbate to your wine. Let's look at some important pre-bottling checks and actions that will reduce your chance of post-bottling disappointments. First, are there any signs of turbidity, flocculation, or sediment? If there are, you may need to rack, fine, or fine again, and or filter. With grape wines, pectin is generally not an issue. There is almost no pectin left at the end of fermentation. Pectin can, however, be an issue with many fruit and country wines. Reds bottled too quickly will throw a deposit and may stain glass. One way to prevent this in young wines is to use gum arabic. Have whites and rosés been protein or heat stabilized? A perfectly clear wine may unexpectedly go cloudy due to protein denaturation. The wine will need a bentonite treatment then. And reds are not an issue since proteins are precipitated by tannins. Have wines been tartrate stabilized? If not, you may need to perform cold stabilization or use what is called a protective colloid, something like carboxymethylcellulose, CMC, or polyaspartates. which are sort of newer products and much more effective in both white and red wines. And you'll want to avoid adding anything, such as fining agents or potassium-containing carbonate salts for the acidifying, this after cold stabilization, because it may affect tartrate stability. And avoid adding anything too close to bottling, as some bottle sedimentation may occur. Next is the wine dry. So is the specific gravity less than 0.995 or at least protected with sorbate. Measure residual sugar and make it part of your analytical process. There are some very easy to use kits such as Vinmetricus. Likewise, has malolactic fermentation completed where obviously it was desired. If there is more than 100 milligrams per liter of residual malic acid, you will need to treat the wine with lysozyme and always in conjunction with sulfite. Make sure you blend all batches into one for bottling to ensure a uniform product. And you should measure and adjust one last time your free SO2, this based on the wine's pH, molecular SO2, and dissolved oxygen. If you measure dissolved oxygen, that is. It's also a good idea to measure total SO2 to see your final SO2 to make sure it is not excessively high. You will find my handy SO2 calculator on my website at the link just posted there on the slide. You'll also want to account for 1 to 2 milligrams dissolved oxygen per liter for oxygen pickup during bottling. This is something that I do in my own winemaking. And this translates into an additional 2.5 to 4 milligrams per liter of free SO2 per milligram of DO per liter. Why 2.5 to 4 milligrams per liter? Well, according to SO2 chemistry, you would need 4 milligrams per liter of free SO2, but in practice, it may be closer to 2.5 milligrams per liter. So you decide and choose. Personally, in my calculations and my winemaking, I use a factor of 2.5. Lastly, but most important, as this is your last chance to make adjustments, taste, taste, and taste again. Invite friends and family to get their opinions, and this is a great way to get their buy-in, especially if you're going to give them bottles, then they can't complain or criticize when you offer them those bottles. As for mouthfeel, body, and balance here, first make sure you have good balance, and good balance according to your taste. And here we're talking about balance between acidity and sweetness, knowing that these two work in opposite directions. So an overly acidic wine may taste mellower and more balanced with a touch more sweetness. If body and structure are lacking, run some bench trials with finishing tannins and or polysaccharides. Examples of polysaccharides include manoproteins, gamma-arabic, and glycerol. And on the flip side, if you're faced with bitter or astringent tannins, there are several solutions you can try, including PVPP, which is very fast and effective. Otherwise, you can try egg white or gelatin, as well as manoproteins or specific inactivated yeast, such as, I'm sure you've heard of, anolese. For flavors and aromas, if you're faced with pesky methoxypyrazines and vegetal green bell pepper aromas that just won't go away, you can try a fining treatment with inactivated dry yeast, something like Noblesse from Lalamont. You should see an improvement in as little as 1 month. Otherwise, rack the wine and repeat the treatment. I had, as an anecdote, I had a Carmenere, Chilean Carmenere, that I just couldn't rid of the vegetal green bell pepper aromas. And I did this treatment and I bottled it, and it was still smelling of green peppers. And I let it rest for a few months since I bottled it. And I opened the bottle just the other night and it's almost completely gone. So it worked really well. As for hydrogen sulfide, if you still have a slight sulfur smell or a detectable smell of rotten eggs, try a copper sulfate fining, making sure to run bench trials to make sure that the amount needed does not exceed safe health limits, which is in the US, 1 milligram of copper per liter of wine. And you can also experiment with oak products and oaking wine. Not only does oak add flavors and aromas, but you can also address flaws using oak. Oak is great for masking certain defects, especially defects like methoxypyrazines that I just described above. Now, if you're not happy with color, it might be too late at this stage to make significant color changes without affecting something else. If you've noticed a drop in color or intensity, it may be due to an inadequate balance between tannins and anthocyanins, anthocyanins being the color pigment molecules. Small amounts of tannins with large amounts of anthocyanins can cause color instabilities. So you can run bench trials adding tannins to see if color can be improved. So you may have a deep, richly colored red with low tannins, and the color will fall apart in a few months. Just as an FYI, this is interesting, a ratio of 4:1 of tannins to anthocyanins is said to be optimal for color stability. And some wineries do measure tannins and anthocyanins, but you would need to invest in a spectrophotometer to be able to measure these parameters. Alternatively, you can blend the wine with another wine. Here, just be careful, because anytime you blend two wines, you essentially have a new wine from a wine chemistry perspective. And that means, it means different chemistry, which means you need to reassess pretty much everything. The caution here is that two stable wines blended together do not guarantee a stable wine. And if you notice, the red color has prematurely given way to an orange, or in the worst case, a brown color, then you have an oxidation problem, in which case you need to check and adjust the free SO2 level as soon as possible.
Dan, we do have some questions racking up if you want to field some questions that I've been collecting from chat.
Yep, sure, I can handle some questions now. I'll take a sip of water.
Catherine Graff wants to know, is there an economical way to fine for people who are just starting out in winemaking? Or maybe is there a cheap and dirty way to get some fining action going?
Well, the cheapest way is not to do any fining, just let gravity and time do their work.
I did.
Otherwise, bentonite works really well. It's cheap. It's clay, so you can't get any cheaper than that.
With the focus on fining in this conversation, somebody asked if how prevalent it is in commercial winemaking. I would think it's almost ubiquitous, except with a handful of producers.
Yeah, you would have to distinguish ultra premium or even premium wines from the more commercial wines that need to be marketed quickly. There is such a thing in commercial winemaking. There is such a thing as cash flow also. So you need to put out products very quickly, and you can only achieve that through proper fining and filtering, depending on
That's right.
the wines.
Now, you had mentioned egg white fining. Somebody asked if there's any salmonella risk with egg white fining.
There isn't. I've seen studies which have tracked that, and there was not even trace amounts of salmonella. Um, I and I don't think. So I'm not a doctor, but I'm just giving you my personal opinion. I don't think any pathogens can survive in wine. So.
Yeah, that's right. Dan would like to know, you mentioned a few times you used the phrase too close to bottling. How do you define too close to bottling? Days, weeks?
Yeah, a couple of weeks. You shouldn't be doing anything within 2 weeks of bottling.
Okay.
And I try and give myself even 4 weeks, just to keep an eye on the wine, make sure that nothing's happening, no tartrates, no, it hasn't gone cloudy or anything. You never know what can happen. So,
Right.
so there's no sense in rushing the bottling.
Sure. Craig Mason asks about wine kits. Malolactic is typically discouraged, and he wants to know about adding lysozyme for fining, and mentions malic acid in terms of wine kits.
In kit wines?
Kit wine, yeah.
Yeah, so there's no need to add lysozyme because the wine has no lactic acid bacteria for it to undergo malolactic fermentation. And with the amount of sulfite that they give you and ask you to add in kit wines, there's no danger of a spontaneous malolactic fermentation.
Right, right. Okay, and Kevin Hart wants to know when is total SO2 how much total SO2 is too much?
Well, if you look at commercial winemaking in the U.S., there are some limits. I think in the U.S. it's around 250 or is it 300? Anyways, in that range, that's parts per million. I keep an eye on it because I keep an eye on it throughout winemaking, that is, not just at the end, because it gives me very good clues as to how the wine is binding and how SO2 is effective. And then I do a final check, make sure that I haven't added too much at the end.
Great. All right. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Okay, so you made all the adjustments necessary to your wine, and you went through all the pre-bottling checks, and now you are ready to bottle. This is where you need to do some serious planning. So plan your bottling well in advance. Order bottles, corks, labels, and capsules, and only buy as many corks as you intend to use, as to avoid unused corks left in an open bag for an extended period of time. Plan your filtration and bottling setup, and this is where you'll often run into unexpected problems. Don't ask me how I know this, but you don't want to deal with leaks come time to filter, or have to deal with a defective head come bottling time. It happens. Likewise, make sure your corker is in good working condition. There is nothing more frustrating than a broken corker. As for corks, choose only the best corks for the type of wine and intended aging duration. Why invest so much time and money creating the best wine possible to then skimp on corks? Cork suppliers now provide OTR data, OTR meaning oxygen transfer rate, and it represents the amount of oxygen that a closure lets in, and is measured in milliliters per day, per month, or year. And in addition to free SO2, OTR has a significant impact on shelf life. So let me do a little demonstration here on the impact with a little simulation that I've put together. Here I have a simple wine shelf life estimation simulator that I tweaked for my own purposes. Looking at the most important parameters, the simulator considers the amount of oxygen dissolved in wine. So here 0.80 milligrams per liter or parts per million. The headspace volume, that is the volume between the wine and cork. And the calculator calculates what is known as total package oxygen, or TPO, which is the sum of dissolved oxygen and headspace oxygen. The target is to have TPO to be less than 2.0 milligrams per liter or parts per million at bottling. The simulator then uses the manufacturer's OTR of the closure as entered, and based on the free SO2, it predicts the shelf life of the wine. In this simulation, all parameters in the two columns are identical, except that here on the left, we are using a closure with a relatively good OTR of 0.0020 milliliters per day, while the one on the right is a rather cheap pour closure with an OTR of 1 magnitude of order higher, so 0.020 milliliter of oxygen per day. That order of magnitude of difference in OTR translates into a direct order of magnitude change in predicted shelf life. In this example, from just under 3.5 years to about 4 months. That's the impact that your closure can have on the shelf life of your wine. Now, let's go back and look at the shelf life using that first closure, the better one at 0.0020 milliliters per day OTR. But now, watch what we're going to do. We're going to increase free SO2 by only 5 milligrams per liter from 35 to 40 to account for the almost 2 milligrams per liter TPO. Remember earlier I said adjust your free SO2 upwards by a factor of 2.5 multiplied by the amount of oxygen. So here it's 2 multiplied by 2.5. So we're going to increase free SO2 by 5 from 35 to 40. So by adding only 5 milligrams per liter free SO2, we have added a whole year to the predicted shelf life. So a mere 5 parts per million increased the shelf life by almost a third. Okay, so I've covered some more advanced topics here today, and hopefully I've given you sufficient information to assess if you want to implement these tips and process enhancements in your own winemaking. And you'll find much more information using some of these resources posted on this slide. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you all for attending.
Daniel, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I know everybody would applaud if they were unmuted, but everybody's muted, which is good. People can just wave their hands or turn their video off and on. It's a nice way to let everybody know that you're paying attention. We do have a few last minute questions, and I'm very happy to open up the floor for anybody who wants to unmute themselves. Spectrophotometer, what are they used for, and is it worth the investment for a home winemaker?
Well, it all depends how technical you want to get in your winemaking. I'm very, very technical. I think most people know that. And part of the reason why I do it also is because I learn a lot while measuring all these various parameters. So a spectrophotometer is in fact expensive. It can be two, three, four, $5,000 depending on what type um, and the quality you're looking for. But it allows you to measure color. So and by measuring color at the different phases or stages of winemaking, and also during wine aging, it shows you how the wine is progressing in terms of color. It also allows you to measure tannins. Allows you to measure anthocyanins. It allows you to measure bitterness. And then you can get enzymatic kits that allow you to measure, for example, individual acids like tartaric acid, malic acid. So it's very, very useful, but all of this requires equipment and some lab skills.
That's right. And Joey DiCarlo would like to know, is there a way to connect common cork types with styles of wine, like specifically age-worthy reds? I would think for an age-worthy red, you basically want to spend a lot, not skimp on the cork.
Well, I mean, it has become so technical. There's so many types of corks now available with different OTRs. Even in one product line of corks, you and commercial wineries do that. They order corks based on OTR, based on the style of wine that they're making and how they intend it to age. And there's no sense spending $1 a cork if you're going to put out you know, a simple white wine that is meant to be consumed within a few months. But if you're going to do a premium wine, you'll want a closure that's going to last 5, 10, 20 years and not have it collapse on you.
Great. Dan Scheffler, the winemaker at Spacetime Meadery, wants to know about lab equipment on a budget. What are some things that you would recommend? Maybe some gotta haves, you know, if you're going to make your first investment.
Yeah, well, yeah, the most basic and most essential, obviously, a hydrometer for measuring your Brix or your specific gravity when you first start out your wine. And then you really have to measure acidity throughout your winemaking. pH is extremely important, so you need a titration kit, which is very cheap. You can get a acidity titration kit for under $10, and it's very easy to run or to execute. Then you need a pH meter. pH is important because it's a measure of microbial stability, and it helps you determine your free SO2 additions. And then it's a bit of an investment, but I'm a big believer in managing free SO2 tightly. So some equipment to measure free SO2 would be your next investment after a titration kit for acidity and a pH meter.
Right. Daniel, for these last few questions, would you mind discontinuing screen share? And anybody else comfortable unmuting and asking Dan a question directly? I don't want to be the only voice heard here.
You asking, David?
That's right, Mike. Go ahead.
All right.
If
I can ask, because I've always been curious, and first of all, thanks, Dan, for a tremendous presentation. I have your original book. I'm going to be getting your next book and look forward to reading it. I learned a lot from your original book.
Thank you.
As far as filtering goes and back sweetening, right? If you back sweeten something, you usually sterile filter as well. Is it proper to filter just before or just after you back sweeten?
I back sweeten when I do sweeten. I back sweeten because then I sterile filter and bottle directly.
So you filter after you sweeten.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah,
All right.
because you want to sterile filter and into bottles as quickly as possible. Because if you sterile filter into a carboy and then you go bottle, you're defeating the purpose.
Thank you.
Daniel, how did you get to be such a great resource for us folks?
You know, I think I make good wines according to my family, and when I don't, they tell me. But I experiment a lot. I've experimented. I like to experiment and discover things. So, and I almost never make the same wine twice in a row. I make different wines, or well, not necessarily different wines, but different techniques every season, because that's how I learn. So to me, making wine is not just making wine as a for drinking, but also as a way to learn.
By the way, if anybody wants to buy Daniel's book, his new book, I just ordered it on Amazon. You have to kind of pay attention to make sure you get the new one, and I encourage you to do that. I hope you don't mind me advertising for you, Daniel.
Absolutely, no, thank you.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Tim Valdez, it looks like you have something to say.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, Daniel, sometimes when you're looking at experimenting every season, though, do you just run into something that you just fall in love with so much? And so when you reproduce it, there's this consistency about what you're doing with it, but maybe slight tweaks, but not too much. It's just coming out great every year. Isn't that what we search for?
Yeah, you know, it's never perfect, and I'm not in wine country, so I don't have access to perfect grapes. You know, I've got to deal with what I have, so I'm always tweaking, and you know, people are scared when dealing with high pH wines. Well, it's my norm. You know, I love high pH wines, and I've come to accept it the way it is and not try and not over tweak because of wanting to bring the pH down. I've got a nice Pinot Noir, a 2016 with a pH that was just around 4. That's still aging very, very nicely in the cellar. So.
I do want to remind everyone that this entire video will be shared on the AWS Now YouTube page for viewing later. I do want to acknowledge some people that we have here so we could talk about some other AWS programs that might be of interest to this group. Kevin Ostrowski of our education committee. Kevin, could you tell us a little bit about some of the educational programs that the AWS offers that might be of interest to winemakers?
Sure, Dave. Thank you very much. Hey, happy St. Pat's to everyone out there, by the way. David, as you highlight, the education for the American Wine Society is a core value. And there are very many offerings that the society provides to its members. This particular venue is one of them, the live Zoom presentations, which have been outstanding in this last couple of years. We also have probably things that most of you are familiar with. There's the National Tasting Project, which is run by Mike Blake this year. The wines are coming from Sicily and some very exciting wines in that lineup. So the National Tasting Project is part of our educational programs. We also have the Wine Judge Certification Program, a 3-year program that certifies an individual as an American Wine Society wine judge. At conference, we in the past have had a class called Super Tasters. That name is being redone. It's now going to be called Wine Smarts, and there's actually 2 versions of it now. An introductory version, level 1, and then I know that we're working currently to develop a level 2 class called Wine Smarts 2, which again is going to complement the first year with a little bit more detail in terms of the world of wine. We also offer the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, the WSET program. That again is a program that is offered, and we are a qualified provider of WSET2. And lastly, the one last thing I shall mention is that as I think, David, you referred to earlier, the American Wine Society does have a YouTube page, which is called American Wine Society Now. There's plenty of educational videos on that YouTube page, which you can look at your leisure. So there are plenty of things that are out there that are offered by the Wine Society as part of our educational core value. Looking forward to a lot of new things coming down the pike, and excellent presentation, Dan. Thank you very much for spending time with us this evening.
Thank you.
Great.
It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you, Kevin, for that overview. Kevin, I don't know if you would agree, but I don't think there is no wine education program out there that teaches false identification to the extent that our wine judge certification program does. It's an exposure that you won't find at any level of WSET or anywhere else. And I think that's one of the reasons why winemakers particularly have found the wine judge certification program valuable for what they do, something they could apply, when they're making their wine.
Absolutely, David. I would say wine fault identification is kind of the signature feature of our wine programs, and highly recommend some additional study there. Just as an example, in our first level, our year one wine judge certification program, it just so happens I happen to know the instructor for wine faults, and we present to the students some 25 to 30 different samples of wine faults that they can experience and become familiar with.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you, Kevin. Thanks for being here. The other part of our team that I would like to acknowledge is Vince Williams to talk about the amateur wine competition, amateur and commercial wine competition. We have some commercial winemakers here. Vince, are you with us?
I am.
Oh, hi, Vince.
How's it going? So we're building on 40 years of winemaking or judging the wines of our members, both on the commercial side and the amateur side. Our commercial team is busy working, getting ready to advertise out to them. I'm starting to build up our brochures and our forms ready for registration for the amateurs. Just got to work out a few of the last minute details with our hosting location out in Bellevue, Washington. I live in Belleville, Illinois, so that's really confusing. So once we get our shippers all squared away, we'll be able to start getting ready to do those registrations. Our competitions last full week in October. Registration closes about 2 weeks prior, gives you plenty of time from the last day you register to shipping all that wine across the country. Hopefully we haven't worked quite out with our shipping site to find out when the earliest you can ship it. Some people like getting it on day one that they're open accepting wines, and we don't mind that. We're working on various improvements in the program, both for our 2022 competition and our 2023 competition right now. Some things take a little time to get through. Don't worry though, we're not going to be measuring any of the brilliance based on NTUs this year. Maybe we'll work on that for 2024. We'll get with Daniel on that. But if you need more information, you can contact me at awc@americanwinesociety.org, or just keep your eyes out on the AWS news, or I'll be blasting out to everybody that's registered previously. So thanks, David.
That's right. Thank you, Vince. And one thing about the AWS competition is you will get constructive feedback back from judges in the amateur competition. And if you go to the conference and you are honored, we have a big celebration. It's one of the few amateur competitions that I know of where you are going to be celebrated among hundreds of your peers. So it's very great in that sense. And also the benefit to the commercial competitors is that we have an incumbent audience of consumers who will use the fact that you got an award to decide whether or not to buy your product. Now, the last thing I would like to offer to the people gathered here today is that what we would like to do at the American Wine Society is to create a winemaker working group. And this would be a committee of winemakers, amateur ideally and commercial as well, who could get together and help and help create events like this on a more regular basis. Obviously, we have a lot of winemakers out there who are willing to share and who are looking for information. And I think that we have the skill set here in our organization to really bring people together and make that happen. So if anybody is interested in serving on a winemaker working group to help do more things like this, and it could be easy. I mean, we have so many talented, even amateur winemakers, even just having a round table where people can get together in the fall and say, my wine is doing this, my wine is doing that. You know, to be able to have somebody who has 20 or 30 vintages under their belt to be able to say, oh, you know, they've seen it all before. They've seen it all, done it all. They've made all the mistakes. And that's the kind of thing that we can do. I mean, it's really great to have Daniel here. Hopefully we'll have him back again. Hopefully we'll have more people like Daniel participating in these programs. But honestly, even roundtables or Ask Me Anything or panels and just regular get-togethers of winemakers, I think would be great. So I put my email in the chat. It's executive director@AmericanWineSociety.org. Reach out to me. Let me know. We'll get a group together and basically get a group together. And I'm there just to support and make things happen. Anybody else have anything else for the good of the order?
I got another question for Daniel, if I can.
Brian, please go ahead.
Yeah, now you had mentioned adding copper sulfate for a wine with a sulfur smell. What I had been told by a commercial winemaker that I know, you know, number one, it can be kind of difficult and a little bit dangerous to work with copper sulfate if you are not super meticulous in the measurements. What he suggested for me, you know, I had about a 6.5, 7-gallon batch of Marquette Red that was left with a sulfur smell. And he said to just add some clean sterilized pennies into the carboy and smell it and taste it every 5 to 7 days, which I did. And from an amateur winemaker perspective, that worked well for me. But is there a downside that you would see to doing that rather than?
Yes. And you're asking a very technical person, an engineer. So here's my answer. First of all, pennies that predate 1982, I think, in the U.S. Contain copper. So anything after that date, there's no copper, and so that wouldn't work. Now, the problem with adding pennies to your wine is you have absolutely no control as to how much copper goes into your wine. So you're not able to measure it. There's no way to control it. So you're basically adding copper, which is what copper sulfate does. But you do it in a controlled fashion using pipettes and doing bench trials. Yes, you have to be meticulous and you have to be able to measure things precisely. But on the flip side, using pennies, you have absolutely no control.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I go ahead and say something?
Please.
Sure, Tim, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to say, I've been a member with AWS for about 5 years now. And this was one of the events that you guys put out there that was, to me, probably one of the best things I could see. And I wanted to thank whoever was involved for choosing Daniel Pambianchi to be a part of this and to help impart his wisdom to us and share his time with us and spend some time with those of us who are making wine, or those of us just love wine and love to know what goes into making wine. He is an ultimate professional. He is so valuable to all of us. And I wanted to thank you guys for doing that. And of course, always thank Daniel for his contributions to what we do and his commitment to what we do. So selfless, such a great guy. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you. Appreciate.
Thanks for the comments,
feedback.
Tim. We hope to
Thank
do
you.
we hope to do more things like this for our members and others in the future. And I think Daniel was a great person to kick this program off for us.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Tim, you have something to say? Tim Rolfson?
Yeah, well, so kind of back to that copper thing, I kind of ran into an issue where I let my Cabernet sit on the gross lees a little too long after pressing off. And this is only my second attempt at using fresh grapes. So I ran into a hydrogen sulfide issue. And as opposed to pennies, it was recommended. There's a winemaking group out of Canada. I don't know what they are, but it was a fellow with a chemistry degree who suggested using a some kind of like a Scotch-Brite pad, only it's made out of copper. I forget what it's called. Stuff it inside of a PVC tube and run the wine over it. So it's kind of the same question as copper, is pennies that are going in there. But you know, is there a better way of addressing hydrogen sulfide than using copper? You know, people talk about splash racking and things like that. Is there a tipping point at which mercaptans become so permanent within the wine that you have to use copper sulfide, or are there other ways to remediate that sooner?
Yeah, the the challenge with volatile sulfur compounds, including hydrogen sulfide, is that if you just have a little bit of it, you do a splash racking and it can resolve the problem. But if you have a lot of it and you've never had to deal with the problem and you go and splash rack, you can actually compound the problem. What is the best solution? It's really avoid it. I've experimented a lot in my winemaking, and knock on wood, and in all the years that I've made wine, not once have I had a hydrogen sulfide problem as an amateur. I've had it a couple of times in our winery, but as an amateur winemaker, I've never had it. If you stay on top of your racking and your winemaking, it should not happen, right? So rack off the gross lees, make sure you're on top of nutrients, nutrient additions for your fermentation, so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of checkpoints, because once it's in the wine, it's very difficult to get rid of, especially using copper tubing and pennies where you have no control.
So if you could suggest.
The real answer is that during the fermentation, you make sure your yeast is properly fed. If you don't have properly fed yeast, it'll develop hydrogen sulfide. If you properly feed the yeast during fermentation, you can avoid the whole problem in the first place. And that really is the key.
Well, if I can ask a follow-up question then,
yes,
with regards to that, the fermentation also became quite warm, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
It breached the 88-degree level. And so what impact, if any, does heat have on the way that the yeast reacts within the fermentation itself? Because
yes,
I know I'm pretty sure it probably killed the malolactic bacteria I put in there.
yeah, I was actually going to respond to Paul. Temperature is a big factor.
No, you're
And because if it's too high or too low, yeast becomes stressed, and then they start releasing sulfur compounds as part of their metabolism. And there's many other factors. So there's nutrients, not only the kinds of nutrients that you add and how much nutrients, and that has to be a function of your specific gravity and Brix. So the higher the sugar or Brix, the more nutrients you need. And also the timing of those additions, you have to add some upfront, some at 2/3 sugar depletion. And there's many other factors, including temperature. So it's quite a task to stay on top of all those risk factors. Absolutely.
I'd like to give away
Keeping your
another
yeast
book.
happy seems to be the key to avoid it.
Happy
Absolutely. Yep.
Daniel,
Thank you.
Stalled fermentations, very bad. Unhappy yeast, very bad. Okay, I want to give away another book. This is going to go back in history a little bit. Remember, you have to be an AWS member to win. You know, Dr. Frank had an epic dispute. And I know you're thinking, well, Dr. Frank had epic disputes with many, many people. But he had an epic dispute with one other key figure in the Eastern wine industry. And it was so bad that when this other figure really got control of the American Wine Society in the mid-1970s, Dr. Frank renounced his membership because what this other person was advocating was so against everything Dr. Frank believed in. No, it wasn't Walter Taylor. They actually used to be buddies. Walter Taylor, no, it wasn't David Falchuk. That's very funny. No, mid 70s. And what this other rising figure in the AWS was advocating, oh, Mark, you can't win twice. Jeez. Mark Reed answered correctly for a second time. And Mark, you can't win 2 books. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was Philip Wagner. Here's the
I
story.
declined to
Philip-
enter since I just ordered Daniel's book. Amazon's going to charge me anyway.
So Philip Wagner was the big advocate for French-American hybrids. He went back to France and found them and brought them back and thought this could be an answer for the Eastern wine industry. And Dr. Frank was all about vinifera, 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 vinifera. So my friend Carlo DeVito, who's a wine journalist, he went down to the University of Maryland, which I guess has Philip Wagner's papers. You know, I guess when you're very important and you die, a library will want your papers. And he went through and he found the letters that Dr. Frank and Philip Wagner were writing back and forth to each other. You need asbestos gloves to read those letters because they were so fiery. And yeah, it was. Yeah, Wagner, Philip Wagner, the founder of Bordy Vineyards, still a really great winery, although it's under different ownership in Maryland. We're going to have to save these books and give them away at the next winemaking session. I think this is what we're going to do. Dan, we can do that in your absence, right? You won't mind.
I don't mind. Go ahead.
Right. Well, Mark Reed, props to you. You better be in our database. You're not getting there. I'm not giving any books out at all today. But all right. Well, you know, that's it for me and my end. Anybody else? Any party words? Well, everybody, thank you for being here. We hope to do this again.
Oh,
If you want to
we
be in
have,
the wine working group, reach out to me. Daniel, thank you for being such a great resource. Actually, for
Thank you.
always being such a great resource for winemakers.
Appreciate you
amateur
having me
and
here.
professional.
thank you so much.
Great.
Appreciate
Everybody
it.
have
Thank
a
you.
great
Thank
night.
you.
Have a great
Thank you,
St.
everyone.
Patrick's Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.